Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. And before I get into our very last episode in this series over the Battle of Britain, I wanted to, of course, go over this week in 44, right? So on the 22nd of April, the Western New Guinea campaign kicks off with Operation Reckless. Hitler and Mussolini begin a 2-day meeting, which would turn into the demise of the relationship between the two nations. Basically, what it was Hitler blaming Mussolini. Well, they're both losers at this point. They're trending towards losing, and because of that, they just want to point fingers at each other. So that is currently what is going on at this time in 44. And while that's all taking place, the SS is committing the Prigoi massacre in Greece, where 563 innocent civilians, all men, women, and children, being murdered. On the 25th, which would be yesterday, of course, Adolf Eichmann, who is widely considered one of the architects of the Holocaust, offers Hungarian Joel Brand the blood for goods deal, allowing 1,000,000 Jews to leave and move towards Allied countries. Now, the Allies believe that this is some form of blackmail, and the deal ultimately falls flat. And on today's date, the 26th, a group of 5 British troops who are behind enemy lines in Crete, working for the SOE, that would be the Special Operations Executive, successfully kidnapped German Major General Heinrich Kripe. Also, as I was reading through the events, there are multiple, and I mean multiple, a lot of U-boats that are being lost during this time as well. So it seems every day that we're losing an entire crew of sailors within the German Navy. So within the Kriegsmarine. So they're in trouble. They are losing these wolf packs by the pack. Huh. No pun intended. They're losing a lot. The war at this point is just getting constantly bloodier and bloodier, with the lines being blurred on who is to be killed and not. And the stage for a brutal fight for Europe has completely been set, right? It's going to be something this world has never seen before. And I mean, in 44, we are 2 months away. We're a month. We are 1 month away from June 6th, relatively speaking. Give a few days. Right. So now that we got that out of the way, let's get to this week's episode. Let's talk about what happened after the bombings in London ended, the people and the government that led their nation through quite literal darkness, what stages were being set after the battle concluded. And now I must say, before I go any further into this episode, it might be the shortest one of them all out of the entire series. And you will see exactly why that is, because I want to talk about the immediate impact and then the future implications. So just please hang tight for this final, short, sweet episode. It's time for us to come out of the shelters now, step into the street. For the first time in weeks, we can hear nothing but the beauty of peace. This is our last episode on our Last Man Standing series, The Catalyst. For those of you that do not know, the Battle of Britain, is a quote unquote officially ended on October 31st, 1940. I say quote unquote while that's, yes, widely agreed upon. Hitler never was like, we're done with the Battle of Britain, or we're done bombing Britain. So the battle never truly ended. It was, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's important to note that October 31st was the day where directives changed within the OKW. The Luftwaffe continued to use England as target practice, or as I would consider a training ground, for their newer pilots and air crews in the preparation for Operation Barbarossa, or what we know as the invasion of the Soviet Union, which would take place the following June. So, what do we mean that this battle ended but bombings continued? The difference between the student pilots I mentioned earlier and the bombing rates taking place during things like the Blitz is that during the Blitz and the entire battle, the Luftwaffe was strategically issuing their force to gain air superiority over the Royal Air Force. That was their whole job. Okay. That's what they were aiming for. Now this is no longer the goal. They are sending new pilots on familiarization runs, and this doesn't scream, "We're bombing the hell out of you," or, "We're trying to get you to go into submission." Once the bombing strategy officially changed for the Luftwaffe on October 31st, the ruins that it left behind, figuratively and physically, were staggering. Remember how at the start of the show when we talked about how the Germans had a substantial amount of operational aircraft compared to the RAF in June? Well, in reality, the heaviest of fighting was only 3 months. Those 2,900 aircraft would shrink to an unbelievably 1,200 aircraft. That means they lost 1,700 and nearly 3,000 airmen would die. Right? So this is nearly 60% of the entire Luftwaffe's operational aircraft at the time had fallen in its fight against the Royal Air Force. But what about the RAF? Well, they too got the hell beat out of them, but they're on some very different numbers. While, yes, they would lose a substantial amount of aircraft as well, primarily most of those being fighter pilots and fighter aircraft, the biggest difference is the death toll. A little over 520 airmen were killed at the same time span as the Luftwaffe. And the reason behind this would be quite simply if the British were shot down, they were either ditching out over their own home country, which means they could be picked right back up and thrown into a new plane if they were uninjured, of course, or if they crash land again in their home country, meaning they will be picked up and have immediate medical assistance if needed. If they're fine, hey, go back to an aircraft, right? They're churning them. It's easy. There's no threat to being murdered by a civilian population that you're currently bombing to death, and they know that you're also being helped on the ground. So, that's a big difference for German pilots, right? Come down. There's instances and there's, stories where, Luftwaffe pilots who had parachuted out were beat to death, and that wasn't just a localized thing in England. That was a whole war thing. So, and especially if you just watch Masters of the Air, they give a really good example of what that looked like. It proves that home field advantage for the British was critical in the RAF's survival. But what were the consequences of all of this for the remainder of the war, right? How did these few short months in 1940 redirect and rewrite the script for the Nazi war machine? Well, like we mentioned in other episodes, the Nazis up until this point were quite literally on a warpath throughout Europe. For us Americans, if we want to take a look at, and I'm not comparing the individuals, I'm going to compare the the warpath, if we will, of Sherman's burning of Atlanta. They are seriously burning this place to the ground, and nobody, and I mean nobody, could stop them up to this point. You see, this was such a hard blow to the Nazis and one they truly did not expect to happen. They took down France, right, basically in 2 months. So how could a small island of Britain compete with the strongest air force the world had ever seen? These losses were ones that can never be made up, and better yet, the Luftwaffe would never truly recover from the battle. Hundreds of prestigious fighter pilots were killed, leaving massive pockets of experience within the Luftwaffe's ranks. While, yes, they would go on to fight against the Soviet Air Force the following year and cause devastation to the Red Air Force, once the Nazis had to go back and fight against the Western allies, the American, British, Canadian, and Commonwealth, and everybody else who is in that grouping, were now equipped with more advanced aircraft and were highly trained fighter pilots. It was unlike any enemy that the Luftwaffe had faced before. Talking about the Soviets, however, was this something that Hitler was just settling for? Right, and when we talked in the last episode, we talked about how Hitler Right before the end in early October, he made the decision to basically, we're going to focus on the Soviet Union. We're going to ditch this. Operation Sea Lion's going to go away. We're going to look at our enemy, right? So, is it something that he settled for? And the answer to that is no. Because if you recall, his eyes were always set on the communists in the East. Those were his enemy and the ultimate enemy of the German people in his eyes. The real irony of all of this is what Hitler was setting out to do against the British people. Um, the name of the game for the Battle of Britain went from knocking out the RAF to using fear as a weapon against the British people to force the government's hand at submission. But Hitler didn't expect the British people just kept on rising. They kept rebuilding. They kept coming out of their shelters every time to restart their next day. It was so unique that in this situation, the tactic should have worked. Entire families stuffed into bomb shelters to endure night after night after night of bombing. I know for me, yeah, I would probably be like, dude, can we surrender? Right? Like, you must think on big picture. We would all want to say, no, we wouldn't. We'd be this, you know, stone face or a stone wall in the face of danger. But when you have your families, when it's not just you, when it's your neighbors being killed, it's all this. Eventually you're going to go to your government and be like, hey, you need to either let us go and you guys go fight this war, or, you know, something's got to happen. But the British didn't. The British in 1940 did not. They kept coming out, right? Even after not knowing if they were gonna be killed. After the bombs stopped falling, over 40,000 British civilians were now dead, with more than double that number wounded. They did not falter one time, and over 2,000,000 homes in Britain were destroyed. In it, over 60% of London's homes being decimated beyond recognition. These are people whose neighbors are being blown to bits by the dozens, and your home is being destroyed. Your place of employment is gone. But every single day, kids are getting up, they're going to school, husbands are going to work. The women take to the streets to care for those who need it. They're going to factories. These people defied the Nazis and Adolf Hitler directly, and this was something they had never faced. They were not just fighting the Royal Air Force. No, 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 no. They were fighting every single breathing person that stood under the United Kingdom's flag. Something Hitler also hadn't truly expected was how this battle specifically began to turn the tides of American ideas of going to war again in Europe. Even after Poland and France fell, the American population was still on the majority agreement that they should basically stay the hell out of this mess, right? Leave it in Europe. There was a strong population that felt like the whole reason that England and Germany were going to war with each other was over Africa. Obviously, we now know that's not the case, and there were many cabinet members, and I believe there was a senator, I can't remember his name, but he ultimately came out and said, England's doomed, but we should still stay out of it. And there's a guy we're getting ready to bring up who kind of went against that. But as these bombings continued, it was clear that these are a global threat, right? The game has changed. The Germans are now targeting the British. Um, and there are those within the American ranks who know, as British, who's one of our strongest allies, they cannot fall here. And that's where we're going to bring up the guy we're talking about, right? A gentleman by the name of General William Donovan, who is quite literally the father of military intelligence in the United States. OSS was his baby. Was sent as a special emissary to the United Kingdom in July of 1940, as he believed that the war in Europe was imminent and that the Americans could not allow England to fall, and would meet with multiple members of parliament, to include that of Winston Churchill. It was because of these meetings, the first official negotiations of the Lend-Lease program, and it was Donovan who personally signed off on the first delivery of 50 American bombers to the RAF in July. It was now clear that the Americans were getting more and more it was now clear that the Americans were getting more and more involved. And by doing so, it crushed Hitler's idea of British not receiving supplies, right? do you remember the Luftwaffe's job when the Nazis invaded Poland? Right, it was just to cut off the supply lines. That's how they got it done. They would rush in fast, cut the supply lines, knock you out. Rush in fast, cut the supply lines, knock you out. They could not now at this point cut the supply lines. Too big of a distance. And what's great is this allows Britain to have direct lines of arms weapons from North America, somewhere Hitler could never touch. Now he gets close to the U-boats and he does do some damage during the Battle of the Atlantic, and that would come slightly later. That's all heating up as well. But the Americans would and the Canadians and would figure out different ways to get supplies there. Anyway, it's important to understand that at this moment the United States see that the British people may actually survive and that their tenacity will hold back the Nazi advance from totally encapsulating Europe. And I really want to move on here and talk about what stage did the Luftwaffe failure over England actually set. But the Nazis were not invincible, right? That's the big point. The Nazis were not invincible. It was during this that the American opinion peeled away from the fact that the war wasn't only a European affair, and Americans were feeling the idea of going to war with the Nazis. Like I said, right? It created that tight bond between the British and the United States. And because of all of this, right? That's why they would pick England to launch the liberation of Europe from. It's where all the Australian, Anzac forces, the Canadians, the Americans, the British, the French, well, not the Vichy, but the French. Uh, that's where they would launch from. This now became their sacred ground of defiance, if you will. It's where the 8th Air Force would run its daylight bombing campaigns out of. And what is more important than all of that, than what happened in England after, is what did it do for the morale of the German people? And the OKW actually did a fantastic job of never giving an opinion of what happened and why the Luftwaffe pulled back from its main attack on the British. Hitler, Goering, and the Nazis were not going to openly accept their first big defeat. That's important. First big defeat. This was just not their mindset. This is the supposedly greatest military ever to exist. How could they be beaten by such a small and fragile Royal Air Force? So instead, it slowly dies out, and the focus is now put on all troops preparing for war in the East. There are two things that the Nazis and nor Hitler could hide from their people. One being the retaliatory bombing from the British on the German population. This was a first for the German people, as up to this point they had not seen an ounce of war in their backyard. So once the British target the German civilian population, those within begin to wonder, well, what is actually happening? On top of that, it's more than clear that the Luftwaffe cannot replenish these fighter squadrons. During the Battle of Britain, the fighter pilots who were openly neglected from high command would be decimated and ultimately drive a firm wedge between the fighter pilots and the remainder of the Nazi high command. As we stated in the Luftwaffe episode, the fighter pilot mutiny would take place later in the war, but the sourness between the pilots and the leaders began from this battle, and it would only continue to get worse as the war would go on. And this can be seen with the fact that the very first jet engine fighter plane was repurposed to make them jet bombers instead. By time Adolf Galland was able to convince Hitler to give them the planes, it was way too late and the war was already basically at its end. But in reality, the main reason that Hitler was unable to beat the British was because he not only underestimated the British, he overestimated his own Air Force's capabilities. We have to remember that these British pilots can simply stay in the air for longer. They were meeting their enemy right after takeoff. The Germans could only fly over England for approximately 20 to 30 minutes once they crossed the channel or they faced the consequences of crashing in the channel on the return flight. The constant switching of times between these runs and forcing pilots to go up over and over again proved to be a fatal flaw for the Luftwaffe. Their men were tired, broken, and being killed faster than they could be replaced. The British were using technology the Germans felt did not serve as a real purpose. While the Germans were preparing for a long withstanding war with the British, they absolutely were not prepared for the British also preparing for the same exact war. The British were fighting the attrition rates, and that allowed them to win every single time. And in reality, the Luftwaffe's leadership under Goering failed to support their men and push them beyond their limits. In all, this battle was much more than just one summer in 1940. And the bombing campaigns between two nations, it proved to the world that you could stand up to this evil juggernaut standing at your front door and could keep fighting no matter how hard they hit you. It rallied the world to realize that this threat needed to be stopped before it went any further, and that allies across the world were preparing to send whatever help they could. From the civilians who rose from the ashes every single night to go rebuild and save their neighbors, to the RAF pilots that would go up over and over again in order to meet their enemy head on, and to the British leadership refusing to falter and unwillingness to appease the threat, it proved to be what mattered the most against the Luftwaffe's tactics. Within the next year, right, we're looking at November, December 1940. So within the next year, the entire globe would be engulfed by this war. In a way, it was the catalyst for many different things. 8 months after the battle ended, the Nazis would launch their surprise attack against the Soviet Union. And while that's going on, the Nazis also began their support to the Italians in North Africa, which, if you recall in our series over that, it would be followed by the bulk of the Battle of Britain. A year after the battle ends, right, the Imperial Japanese would push shockwaves through the South Pacific by attacking Pearl Harbor, officially bringing the United States into war, right? Obviously, Hitler would declare war on the United States a couple days later. Now the world is now at war. Within 1 year of the Luftwaffe's failure, it would start the end of the Nazi war machine, as the world now knew the Nazis could be beaten. Thank you all so much for turning into the series 10 weeks. It's how long it took us to get through 5 episodes every other week, 10 weeks. You guys hung out, and I am so grateful. The 5 episode series we did here was absolutely amazing. And as an American, I felt like I was learning something new every single week. It's been great, and I hope all of you have seriously enjoyed the over 3 hours worth of content covering the people, the fighters, and the outcomes of the Battle of Britain. I hope to be able to do more of these in the future and would love to hear which battles or scenarios or moments in World War II you would want a deep breakdown of. We will not be doing a series on our next episode or starting a series. We will be doing a standalone. And this one might be rather interesting to some of you. We're going to cover the life and audaciousness of a man by the name of Witold Pilecki. For those of you who have never heard of this man, just a brief introduction would be that he was a Polish military officer that intentionally got himself captured and imprisoned at Auschwitz to see if the rumors that the world had been hearing were true. His story is compelling, it is heartbreaking, but of all things, it is courageous, and that is why we are going to talk about him. And I am beyond excited to be able to dive into his life story because he's worth it. As always, thank you all so much for coming back every week. You are amazing and drive me every day to do better for this community. Make sure you leave us a rating and a review if you really love the show, as it helps us expand to new folks. Come follow us on all the socials at World on Fire Podcast. Jump on there and tell us what you will be doing to commemorate the upcoming 80th anniversary of the official liberation of Europe. I know many of our listeners plan on traveling to the events in France, so please make sure you share those experiences with us. Until then, you all be safe, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks.